All right, there we go. Let's do, some of this is going to be a review of the review already. So we're going to look at the Civil Rights Movement. This is a PowerPoint presentation put together by some AP students from years past. So I'm just borrowing from them. So let's take a look. Of course, one of the most famous early events is Brown versus Board of Education. 1954, there you see little Linda Brown and her mother sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court. Overturned a previous Supreme Court decision. We've also talked about this, and I think you know it confidently. 1892's Plessy versus Ferguson. The idea that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal. Is that door unlocked?
Yeah, it's locked.
Oh, it's locked. We'll just leave it cracked open then. All right. So that starts the ball rolling. That's the first victory, but there are many, many challenges yet, because it's not like the Supreme Court decision is going to then all of a sudden open up the hearts and minds of people throughout the country. In fact, as we know, there is resistance. What kind of resistance? Massive resistance. We're going to see that coming up here. So 1954. Look, Grimm, this is Grimm. 1955, Emmett Till and his mother insists on an open casket because of the brutality, and she wants the world to see what had happened. I think we know the story of Emmett Till pretty well. Strangely, it's a story that a lot of Americans don't know. And we, of course, find it important because he's a fellow Chicagoan, and his final resting place is just a couple miles away. All right. Rosa Parks, same year, the Montgomery bus boycott, and this is really the beginnings of many Americans' understanding of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a young Martin Luther King Jr., although prominent on stage is Rosa Parks, and she works with the SCLC. And unlike kind of the story and the myth, she's not an old woman. She's not tired, like from working physically. When she said she was tired, she says she's tired of giving in, tired kind of like emotionally and having to deal with segregation. She's actually waiting for an opportunity to violate the law. She's looking to spark something. So it's not like she's being arrested against her will. She wants this to happen. In fact, that's going to be the whole goal of the Civil Rights Movement, is to peacefully, nonviolently resist unjust laws. They're hoping to get arrested. They want it filmed. They want the world's attention. So they're not... Being arrested is part of the plan. Being attacked is part of the plan. Suffering blows is part of the plan, which makes my appreciation of what they do even greater, because they know violence is coming at them. All right. 57, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Really becomes more prominent. Again, he's associated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is where we start to see the organizations start to develop some of the tactics that will become associated with them, particularly marches and peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations that we'll see later on with Selma, the march at Selma, the Birmingham march using the children that we saw in our video in class. So he's a young preacher about to step onto a big, big stage. Integration of Little Rock schools, same year, and we noticed, we looked at that when we saw the segment from Eyes on the Prize. Testing the earlier Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court decision used the words that the schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed, but now it's 3 years later, they're still being kept out of Little Rock schools. Orville Faubus refuses to offer proper protection to these students, and as a result, Eisenhower has to send down the National Guard. 1960, we have the first sit-in at Greensboro, North Carolina. And 4 students from a local college go to the Woolworths counter and demand service. And as you can see, there's some interesting ironies and juxtapositions, because often many of the people behind the counter were African Americans. African Americans could shop in the drugstore. They could even buy food for takeout, but they couldn't sit at the counter. So they sit down. They're refused service. They just get out their homework and they wait. Soon, white mobs show up, drag them off their chairs, and then just as soon as they're off, then there's a second wave that comes in. Again, they want confrontation. They're not shying away from the violence. They've done workshops to prepare for this. And they want it to be documented. They want it to be filmed. They want to fill up the jails, because this will, again, make the statement. And all of this only works is if they don't fight back. Plus, there's an economic element, right? So if they can hurt Woolworths economically, they can say, hey, you can't take our money and not give us proper rights. Following up from the bus boycott, then we have the Freedom Riders of 1961. Again, black and white individuals testing to see whether interstate bus travel is desegregated, particularly rest areas, particularly bus stations, restaurants along the route, bathrooms, drinking fountains, the like. They're met with angry mobs at the stations. They're beat up, they're threatened, they're harassed. In one case, the bus is stopped along the route and set on fire. So there's an example there. In 1963, we have the Birmingham campaign. Martin Luther King Jr. is arrested. He writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail responding to his critics. White pastors particularly, but not only white, but mostly, saying, what are you doing down here? You're just agitating. We're sympathetic to a point, but let us handle it in our time. But basically, the theme of the writing is, sure, you say you're going to handle it in due time. You say I'm an outside agitator, but every time somebody says wait always means never. And so we've waited long enough. It's almost 100 years since the end of the Civil War. So we can't wait anymore. We can't wait anymore. The hoses and dogs, I think you know what that's referring to. Medgar Evers, a civil rights worker in Mississippi, and I think we told the story today in history. He's shot in his driveway coming back from a rally. Killed in front of his family by Byron de la Beckwith. Then we have the March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech, and shortly after the Birmingham church bombing, 4 young girls in a Sunday school class are killed when Klansmen bomb the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. You'll remember from the video, what was the nickname of Birmingham? Bombingham. Yeah. So we're in 1963, we're not even 10 years into the modern civil rights movement. Of course, when I say modern civil rights movement, I'm acknowledging the fact that we've had civil rights movement for a long, long time. Maybe even all the way back to 1619, right? Talked about African Americans making progress during wars and World War I and World War II. The double V, for instance. All right, let's move on. I know I'm going fast. So there's some more pictures from the events that we just mentioned. We don't need to write those down. Freedom Summer, 1964. And this is the attempts to register voters to overcome discriminatory laws like the poll tax, for instance, so the 24th Amendment. The Freedom Summer saw a number of people being trained in the North and going down into the South. These, again, are young college people. They've even taken a gap year. That's the popular thing to say since Malia, right? So taking a year off of school, getting specialized training, and going down into some pretty terrible places as far as hostility, places like Mississippi. And the missing bodies found refer to 4 of these civil rights workers that end up being disappeared, and their bodies are found actually buried in an earthen dam. And they were down there registering people to vote. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are kind of the federal legislative results of all this process. Getting rid of the last vestiges of discrimination, and then also the Civil Rights Act getting rid of any barriers to the voting process. Uh, 1965, Bloody Sunday. This is the Selma March. 2 attempted marches. The first march ends like this. The second march is escorted by, well, just take a wild guess. Well, who escorted in Little Rock in 57? National Guard, yeah. So we have a lot of interesting layers of politics, right? So we got a lot of states issues, and then where the states don't comply, you've got the federal government stepping in a couple ways. You got Supreme Court decisions, and what did critics of the Warren Court call what the court was doing in terms of their legislation? Judicial activism, right? And then you've got the president in the role of the executive, then sending in troops to protect marchers and execute orders of the court. What's happening after 1965 is a growing frustration among many, and we'll talk more about these people in another slide presentation. So there's a growing frustration that civil rights is coming too slowly. And so what happens is we get a split in the movement. So remember, the Vietnam War is also going on, and so you've got violent protests springing up. One group called the Weathermen, and we talked a little bit about them. I'll talk more. Some students that had been in SNCC, do you remember what SNCC stands for? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Some of them, like a guy named Stokely Carmichael, and you'll see his name in just a little bit, they form Black Panthers. They start talking about Black Power, and they start agitating more aggressively for change. And then you've got Malcolm X coming into that mix as well. In the next year, King is going to be assassinated, and we're going to talk much more about '68 in just a little bit. Some other judicial decisions. Loving versus Virginia. Can you guess from the image what this is? Yeah, it got rid of laws that said interracial laws or interracial marriages were illegal. And I just love it that the couple's last name was Loving. It's perfect. Come on. Civil Rights Act of 1968. If you were in today's review session in the morning, we looked at a map of Chicago and how it's broken down by race, and we talked about block busting and redlining, about how certain neighborhoods were kind of almost set up to fail, and those became black neighborhoods. The Civil Rights Act of '68 was a response to the discrimination in housing and loans and federal loans for housing and so on. So it gets confusing, all these voting rights acts and civil rights acts of various years. But yeah, it could. But here's where we can pause and say, do you know the general story? Yes, you know the general story is that we've got levels of legislative and governmental attempts to coerce or coax an unwilling South or Southern states or cities even towards recognizing civil rights. And if you can remember, the presidents at the time. So notice it's Lyndon Johnson signing this, but 1968 is also an election year. Who will be elected in 1968? Richard Nixon will. So we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. 1971, I believe this is the last slide here. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, Board of Education. You might be able to guess from the image. You've got black and white children standing in line in front of a bus. What did this decision allow? Yeah, the busing of students across district lines in order to encourage integration of schools in Boston. And so here we've been telling the story of racial tension in the South. What was happening in Boston, in some poor white districts, African Americans were being bused into poor white neighborhoods to attend those schools. And there was a lot of tension about that. And so parents refusing to allow this to happen. And so we have fighting and resistance in the streets in the South, but then it's also happening in the North as well. All right. Yeah. Hey, they put a works cited in there. That's wonderful. All right, we'll stop there. Any questions?